It's 1953, and a man named Vince is clocking in at a steel plant on the edge of Pittsburgh. The clock on the wall reads 6:58, not 6:55, not 7 o'clock. 6:58. He didn't choose that number. Nobody told him to pick it. But every man on his line clocks in between 6:56 and 6:59, and the foremen clock in at 7:02. 2 minutes. Nobody wrote that gap down anywhere. There's no rule in any handbook that says a foreman arrives after the men he supervises. But if a foreman showed up at 6:58, standing at the gate while the floor filled in around him, every man on that line would have noticed, and not one of them would have said why it felt wrong. That 2-minute gap is the first rule of this video, and it's a small one. It's a rule nobody stated, and everybody followed, because the alternative was being the man who didn't understand his place in a system built entirely on men understanding their place without being told. Vince worked that line for the better part of 3 decades, and the rules that ran his life there were never posted on a board. They lived in silence, in timing, in the particular way you didn't look at a man, in what you let go unsaid to people who outranked you and people who'd betrayed you, and in one obligation that outranked all of it. The kind that pulled men back together even after everything else had pushed them apart. Before we get into what those rules actually were, if you found your way to this channel, you're someone who understands that the past isn't just dates and battles. It's the unwritten codes men lived by and never explained, because explaining them would have meant admitting how much of a man's life was governed by things he never agreed to out loud. That's what this channel is built on. Stick around. Number 5. The timing. The 2 minutes between Vince's clock-in and his foreman's wasn't about punctuality. It was about rank, performed every single morning without a single word. Arriving first meant you were the labor. Arriving exactly on time, down to the second, meant you respected the line enough to never make another man wait on you, and never so early that you looked like you were trying to get noticed by somebody above your station. There was a window, and the window was narrow, and every man on that floor had memorized it without ever being told it existed. The foreman arriving after the men wasn't generosity. It was a small, repeated reminder that his time was worth more than theirs, that he could afford to be unhurried while they could not. Vince understood this by the time he was 20. He never said it out loud to another living soul. Saying it out loud would have made it real, and making it real would have meant admitting he'd accepted it. Number 4. What you didn't say to the foreman. A union floor in 1953 ran on a second language, and the first rule of that language was that you never let the foreman see you think. You didn't argue with a bad call on the floor. You didn't explain yourself when you were wrong, and you didn't explain yourself when you were right either, because explaining yourself was a kind of begging, and begging was the one thing a union man could not be caught doing. If a foreman criticized your work, you said yes or you said nothing. You did not say but. The men who said but were the men who got written up for things that had nothing to do with the actual complaint. Because the foreman had 100 ways to make a man's life difficult that never showed up in any official report. Vince watched a younger man learn this the hard way in his second year on the floor. The kid corrected a foreman in front of 6 other men over a measurement that didn't matter. He was right. It didn't help him. He spent the next 4 months getting every job nobody wanted, and nobody on that floor, including Vince, said a word in his defense, because defending him would have meant becoming visible in exactly the way you were never supposed to become visible. Number 3. What you didn't say to the man who crossed the line. Number 4 was about one man staying quiet in front of one foreman. This rule was bigger. It was a whole floor acting as a single body without ever agreeing to. When a man crossed a picket line, the union floor didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no confrontation at the gate. What happened instead was collective, coordinated by nothing, and it lasted far longer than any individual grudge could have on its own. Nobody spoke to him, not in anger, not in argument. He simply stopped existing in conversation, for every man on that floor at once, as if a vote had been taken that no one remembered casting a ballot in. Tools went missing from his station and were never found. He ate lunch alone for years. Men he'd known since before the war would look through him like he was a window. Nobody organized this. Nobody needed to. It was understood the way the 2-minute gap was understood, and it was enforced more completely than any contract clause the union ever negotiated. because a contract only bound the company. This bound the men to each other, and it bound them by making the cost of breaking solidarity a kind of social death that outlasted the strike itself by 20 years. Vince knew a man who crossed in 1959. He was still being frozen out in 1975, working 16 years past the strike that caused it, surrounded by people who had decided, without a meeting and without a vote, that some debts don't get paid down. The rules so far were personal. They lived between two men, or between one man and a floor that had decided to treat him as a single thing. The rules that follow are bigger than any one grudge or any one foreman. They are the rules the system itself enforced, the ones built into the structure of the floor rather than the temperament of the men on it. Number 2. The funeral rule. There was one obligation on that floor that outranked every other unwritten law, and it had nothing to do with the job itself. When a man died, whether he was still working the line or had been retired for 20 years, you went to the funeral. Nobody posted a sign-up sheet. Nobody checked names at the door. But every man on that floor knew, without being told, that this was the one rule with no acceptable excuse except the ones you could prove. Out of town, in a hospital bed yourself, something a foreman could verify if anyone bothered to ask. I didn't feel like it existed as a category. Neither did I know him well. Vince went to dozens of these over the years. Men he'd worked beside for 6 months in 1958 and never spoken to again after the shift ended. Men whose first names he'd forgotten and whose funerals he still attended because the obligation didn't depend on closeness, only on having stood on the same floor. He stood in church basements and funeral parlors across 3 decades, in a dark suit he kept for no other purpose, because the alternative was being remembered as the man who hadn't shown up. Nobody could have told you, in 1953, why this mattered more than almost anything else on that floor. It wasn't in the contract. It wasn't enforced by any steward, but a union was. Underneath the dues and the grievances and the negotiated wages, a promise that the men around you would notice if you disappeared, and would stand in a room together to prove it. Skipping the funeral wasn't rude. It was a quiet way of saying that the promise had never applied to you in the first place, and the men in that room would remember exactly who said it. Number 1. The rule about ambition. And then there was the rule nobody could fully explain even to themselves, the one about staying. Vince had it in him to go further. Other men on that floor knew it. A few foremen knew it. He had the kind of mind that could have moved into the office side of the operation, and more than one person suggested it to him over the years. He never took the suggestion seriously, and if you'd asked him why, in 1953 or 1963 or 1973, he would have given you an answer that didn't quite hold together. Something about loyalty to the men he worked beside. Something about not wanting to be the man who used the union to climb out of it. That answer wasn't entirely false. There was real loyalty in it. Leaving the floor for the office meant leaving the side of every negotiation that mattered and joining the other one. And a man who did that was rarely welcomed back. Not really. Not the way he had been before. The line did punish ambition that looked like betrayal. That part was real. But it wasn't the whole truth, and Vince knew it wasn't, even if he never said so. The seniority system that protected him on that floor for 30 years was the same system that made leaving feel like starting over from nothing. The plants weren't handing out promotions to union men in any real number, regardless of a man's talent. The ceiling was built into the structure long before Vince ever decided, consciously, to stop reaching for it. He told himself it was a choice. Some of it was. Most of it had already been decided for him by a system that needed men to stay exactly where they were, and gave them a story about loyalty so the staying would feel like something they'd chosen instead of something that had simply been arranged. His wife Helen never asked him to take the office job. She mentioned it twice across 30 years, both times in passing. Both times dropped the moment he changed the subject. She ran the house on a line worker's wage instead of a foreman's, and never once said out loud what that gap might have bought them. Whether her silence was the same kind as his, agreement dressed up as acceptance, or something else entirely, Vince never asked, and she never offered. Vince retired off that floor in 1981, 28 years after he first clocked in at 6:58. He never once arrived late, and he never once arrived early enough to be mistaken for trying to impress anyone above him. The rules he lived by were never written down, because writing them down would have made them negotiable, and a man could not negotiate with a clock, or with silence, or with a system that needed him to believe his place was something he'd chosen. The 2 minutes between his clock-in and the foreman stayed exactly 2 minutes for 28 years, and Vince spent every one of those years inside a code that told him exactly who he was, and never once told him whether he'd agreed to it. If you ever clocked in 2 minutes early without knowing why, hit subscribe. There is more forgotten, honest history like this waiting for you, and the next story is ready when you are.